Over 9 days and 8 nights, 20 PleasureWay Class B Campervans hopped from lighthouse to lighthouse along Washington, Oregon, and California's Lost Coast. We would see some of the rockiest and windiest cliffs that our nation has to offer. I met up with the group in Anacortes, Washington, where we would stay the first night at the Fidalgo Bay RV Resort. That's my campervan Ramsey, parked between 3 other PleasureWays. People had come from Denver, Arizona, Oregon, Washington, and California. There were lovely walks, and we were right across from Puget Sound, as well as the Shell oil refinery. My corgi, Annie, and I would take a lot of walks. Our plan for day 1 was to drive to Coquille, take the ferry to Port Townsend, and end up in Gig Harbor. My ferry reservation wasn't until 2:45, so I spent some time exploring Anacortes. On the western side of the peninsula is Washington Park. You can drive a loop around the park and from there see the San Juan Islands. I drove from there to Coquille, got an ice cream, and walked around. I was really excited to take Ramsey on the ferry. I learned later I had goofed. The Admiralty Head Lighthouse is on the Coquille side of the water, not the Port Townsend side of the water, so I missed that lighthouse. I went straight to the Point Wilson Lighthouse in Port Townsend. Captain George Vancouver named the point after Captain George Wilson, his colleague, in 1792. The current lighthouse was built in 1914 and is still functioning. Passing this interesting house on the way, we went to the Point No Point Lighthouse. Explorer Charles Wilkes in 1841 approached this point expecting it to be larger than it was. The original lighthouse was commissioned in 1872. Home for the night was Gig Harbor in, you guessed it, Gig Harbor, Washington. The itinerary for day 2 was to travel from Gig Harbor through Tacoma to Brown's Lighthouse. There would be a lot of traffic in Tacoma. Some friends who were from the area asked if I wanted to follow them through a more scenic route. This would take us by the Hood's Canal. They pointed out Toano State Park, Alderbrook Resort, and the place where Bill Gates has his family retreat. We caught up with the rest of the gang in Westport on the Pacific coast. Gray's Harbor Lighthouse is Washington's tallest. We took a quick tour of Westport, a little seaport, and scoped out where we wanted to return for the night for fish and chips. The American Sunset RV Resort served as home for the night. Along with peace and quiet, they offer horseshoes, a children's playground, and facilities and hookups for every size RV. During the heyday of lighthouses in the late 1800s, there was one approximately every 40 miles along the Oregon and Washington coast. On day 3, we saw 2 lighthouses that were much closer together. Cape Disappointment Lighthouse was built first, but seamen couldn't see it soon enough before they entered the Columbia River, so the North Head Lighthouse was built. To get there, we skirted the inside of the Willapa Bay, which is known for its oysters. As I entered the bay, I got distracted as I drove through Raymond. A variety of artists have sculpted steel people and animals commemorating the town's logging and pioneer heritage. I also liked this old Sears Roebuck building. American natives harvested oysters in Willapa Bay long before Europeans descended upon them. This map shows how the 2 lighthouses are related to each other. The red circle at the bottom is the Cape Disappointment Lighthouse, which was built first. The yellow circle next to it is the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center, and you actually see the Cape Disappointment Lighthouse from the center. Then the circle on the top left is the North Head Lighthouse, which is where we started. The 2 small buildings are where the kerosene was kept. We got a tour of the interior and, of course, a great view. From the parking lot of the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center, you can walk to the center, and you can also walk the steep hike to the Cape Disappointment Lighthouse. Most people chose to see the lighthouse from the Interpretive Center and take advantage of our zoom lenses. For $5, you can take the self-guided tour through the Interpretive Center and learn all about the Lewis and Clark expedition. This banner highlights all the explorers, starting in 1788 with Captain Meares. One of the rooms highlighted one of the lenses developed by Augustin Jean Fresnel in the early 1800s. Most of the lighthouses we would see had one of these lenses. Fresnel early on understood light waves. He figured out how to use prisms to bend the light waves and concentrate them into one place and make a very strong light. The lights themselves started off as whale oil lamps, then they were kerosene lamps, and now we have electric lamps. But the lens has remained the same. By rotating the lens around the light at various speeds, you can change how often the light shines from a particular lighthouse, known as its signature. That's how a ship captain can tell which lighthouse he's looking at. The lenses come in various sizes, from first order to 6th order. This is a first order light, and they can be as tall as 8.5 feet. The 6th orders are about 1.5 feet tall. After reading about the difficulties that Lewis and Clark had negotiating our rivers, it's amazing we have a bridge crossing from Washington to Oregon over the Columbia. A mile from the bridge, the Columbia River Maritime Museum taught us even more about shipping along the river. This time we stayed in a state park campground at Fort Stevens.
I have to have our fearless leader in the picture.
No, you don't.
Yes, I do. And his dog lady.
Thank you.
Day 4 took us to 2 more lighthouses, Tillamook and Cape Meares, with lunch at the Tillamook Cheese Factory. As its name implies, the Tillamook Rock Lighthouse is on a rock, and it's quite a distance from shore. But it's also a nice view of the coastline. The Tillamook Cheese Factory is right on the highway, easy to find. They have a showroom, a restaurant, and an amazing selection of ice cream. The visitor center was surrounded by dairy farms. The road to the Cape Meares Lighthouse was closed and my GPS didn't work, so I couldn't find the alternate route. But Sherry Georgie shared this picture and said they gave a great tour. I also missed out on seeing the nearby Octopus Tree. I headed to Lincoln City, where we would be staying at the Premier RV Resort. Traveled through forests, chopped down forests, and some beautiful rocky coves. Day 5 was a busy day. We got up close and personal to 4 lighthouses, drove through 2 national forests, crossed 4 major rivers, and turned out at 3 unusual rock and sea formations named after the devil. The first turnout is called Boiler Bay. This turnout is called Rocky Creek. My favorite was overlooking the town of Otter Rock. And once you're in Otter Rock, you reach the Devil's Punch Bowl. A lot of us reached the parking lot of the Yaquina Head Lighthouse at the same time. That's where there's a visitor center. From there, some drove and some walked to the lighthouse. It's one of the most visited lighthouses, but on this day, the inside was closed. Only 5 minutes from the Yaquina Head Lighthouse, we found the Yaquina Bay Lighthouse, which was abandoned after a year or so, hence the Yaquina Head Lighthouse. In this lighthouse, we were given a tour of the keeper's quarters. This keeper had 7 children. To be a light keeper, a man needed to be married, hopefully have children, and be able to read so he could keep the books. Almost exactly 40 miles farther south, after crossing more rivers and this gorge known as the Devil's Churn, we reached the Heceta Head Lighthouse. It was a beautiful quarter-mile walk from the parking lot to the lighthouse.
They had the soot on there. Every day they had to clean it, put fresh oil in there, and have it ready to go by 10 a.m. on that morning.
Each of the little side buildings once stored 6 months worth of kerosene. We also got a look inside the tower. And approximately 40 miles south, we reached the Umpqua River Lighthouse, in time for the final tour of the day. Inside, an exhibit explained the various lights from kerosene to electric. Best of all, we got to step right into the Fresnel lens. This one's unusual because it shines red and white light.
And the cable went down through that hole that was up here and it went down. And anyway, that got replaced by this electric motor. It's a 0.68 horsepower motor is all it is. Operates the whole thing.
Whereas some of the Fresnel lenses were made in England, this was made in Paris in 1890. Just 5 miles south of Umpqua River Lighthouse, we tucked into Tugman State Park for the night. Day 6 and 7 included Mother's Day. We would stay 2 nights at the Humbug Mountain State Park. Some of us saw all 3 lighthouses on Saturday and rested on Sunday. I and some others backtracked to Cape Blanco the second day. The only way to see the Cape Arago Lighthouse is from a parking lot at the end of the cape and using your zoom lens. It used to guard the entrance to Coos Bay. The light was switched off in 2006 when it was replaced by a lighted buoy. Then we drove another 38.5 miles south along coastline and beautiful hills. Some were covered in green trees. Others had been clear-cut. fellow travelers assured me these forests were being replanted. The Coquille River Lighthouse is a cute little guy. It barely survived the wrecking ball. It's one of the 8 surviving lighthouses on the Oregon coast. Locals decorate it for Christmas. Its job has also been replaced by a lighted buoy. We crossed the river to have lunch in Bandon, a little fishing village. It was 38.5 more miles down to Humbug State Park. I haven't even hooked up yet, and Annie's found her place. There, in this meadow, where we are signed in. The next day, I would backtrack to Cape Blanco. But first I wanted to explore Port Orford. Port Orford's claim to fame is that it was the first city that the Americans from the East Coast settled when they came to settle the West Coast. Cape Blanco is the most western point on the Oregon coast, and also the windiest. This was the only lighthouse that charges an entrance fee, a whopping $2. A room with a view. Right below the lighthouse is a farm that was once owned by the Hughes family. The state gives tours of this Victorian mansion. The surrounding area is still cow farms. Annie and I enjoyed the rest of Mother's Day. We mingled with the group, and we watched Bill Sprague making pork chops with pineapple and whiskey. Then Annie and I took a walk with Bill's wife BJ and their dachshund Sunny. From Port Orford to Trinidad is 142 miles. We had 2 lighthouses to visit, but we wouldn't be able to see the inside of either of them. Pelican Bay was the last stop in Oregon, and we crossed the border into California to Crescent City. The thing about this drive along the Pacific coast is that there is an amazing view around every turn. I stopped in Gold Beach to fill up with gas because the price in Oregon was about 60 cents less than it would be in California. The Pelican Bay Lighthouse isn't open to the public. Even though it was commissioned by the U.S. Coast Guard to mark the entrance of the Chetco River, it was built by a man named Bill Caddy who wanted a lighthouse on his beach house and first lit in 1999. It overlooks a parking lot, an old boatyard, and an RV park that I thought might be fun to come back to because it's right by the water. Battery Point Lighthouse is a tricky one. You can only visit it about 2 hours a day when the tide is out. We were there at about 11 o'clock in the morning and the tide still covered the path. But some people showed up later and were able to get a tour. It's one of the older lighthouses built in the Cape Cod style with the tower coming out of the center rather than at the side. The location also had cell service, something we'd been missing for a while, so I took advantage of the time in the parking lot to catch up on my emails. Important to me, but not on the agenda, was driving through Redwood National Forest. It was on our way between Crescent City and Trinidad. My goal for the first year of owning my RV, Ramsey, was to visit all the national parks in California. This was the last on my list. I stopped at the Prairie Visitor Center and got a stamp on my passport. We spent our last night under the redwoods at the Emerald Forest RV Park in Trinidad, California. It's another place I hope to return to. That night, we honored Tim O'Malley, who organized this fabulous rolling rally. From Trinidad Bay to Cape Mendocino is only 104 miles, but the last leg is so wiggly, and we had so much trouble finding Trinidad Head Lighthouse that I didn't get to Mendocino until the very end of the day. Some of my fabulous new friends weren't going to make it all the way to Mendocino, so Annie and I said a few goodbyes. Trinidad Bay was only about 5 minutes away, but what you see here in the parking lot is just a replica of the lighthouse. The lighthouse is really on the hill to the right. My friend Andy and I were the only ones willing to make the hike. It was a gorgeous one, wrapping around the hill. At each turn, we expected to see the lighthouse. 45 minutes later, we came to a fence with a sign that said that the lighthouse was only open to the public the first Saturday of each month. We were bummed, but down below we saw a wharf. Maybe, we thought, if we walked to the end of the wharf, we could see the lighthouse. But we couldn't. We had barely put a dent in a long day of driving. It was time to move on. Table Bluff Lighthouse is in a parking lot by the marina in Eureka, California. Today, it is merely decoration. Once upon a time, it was in Table Bluff, farther south. The restaurant there, overlooking the marina, has terrific clam chowder. The other 5 who had arrived at Table Bluff turned north again. I was the only one who headed south toward Cape Mendocino. The Mendocino Lighthouse is actually not on Cape Mendocino. It's in Shelter Cove. To get to Shelter Cove, you turn right off of Highway 101 and follow a very wiggly road. You then come to the edge of a cliff, and looking down you see Shelter Cove. With your brakes already stinking of burnt rubber, you make a vertical drop of hairpin turns. Shelter Cove is little more than a fishing village with an airstrip and a lighthouse, and fortunately an RV park, because it was already 5:30 in the afternoon. As you can see, there's no trouble finding the lighthouse, and it's lovely. Its only function to decorate the cove. You can see the RV parked behind to the right. I paid my $36 and parked facing the airstrip and the ocean. After some dinner, I took a walk around the cliff. The seals were already sound asleep. A hang glider took off from a cliff and glided around for about 20 minutes. Then he landed on the airstrip right by my RV. Some whales had been playing out by a buoy the night before, so I sat on the cliff hoping I would see them, but they didn't come back. At least I got to spend my last night with my favorite lighthouse out my window. Thanks so much for watching. If you liked this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. See you next time.